In this video, we're going to take a look at process mapping, in particular high-level process mapping, a technique that's used typically at the beginning of a process improvement project. And the learning objectives are going to be to understand the role a high-level process map has and how it differs as a tool from a detailed process map. Some of the rules of thumb that are associated with creating a process map, including, how complex should it be, how many steps should you show, what types of symbols should you use. And then we'll take a look at how to perform a facilitated group meeting in which you map out a process using the back-to-front process mapping approach. All right, I've cleaned up my screen and I'm pulling information from the Business Process Improvement workbook right now. But before we get into how you build a high-level process map, because that's what everybody asks the questions about, Scott, how do we get it built? I want to make sure that the couple of questions get answered up front. What's the intended purpose and when is it performed? Let's cover purpose first. The goal of a high-level process map is different than the goal of a detailed process map. The primary purpose of a high-level process map is to be used as a communication tool. You know, the old overused cliche, a picture's worth 1,000 words, is exactly true when it comes to process improvement work. It's a communication tool to make sure, first, that the team's all clear about what it is that is to be worked on and not to be worked on. We then use the high-level process map as a communication tool to make sure that the sponsor and other decision makers associated with this initiative understand the scope of work and where are the areas of investigation. We then will use a high-level process map when we go out and interview stakeholders. High-level process map's intended purpose is to communicate. And the best way to communicate is to create clarity through simple messages. It's not a detailed tool for analysis. That's what a detailed process map is for. Detailed process maps are used primarily by the team only, and therefore root cause analysis and getting a detailed understanding of current and future state condition. High-level maps, on the other hand, should be simple and straightforward, a simple picture that everybody can understand. Let's take a look at when we do high-level process mapping. It makes sense if we're building a simple picture of the process that this is something that we would do early in a process improvement project. And so what I've got here is our summary sheet for 5-step to make problem solving approach. And what I want to do is I want to zoom in so you get a sense of when the high-level process map is created and used. And so I'm using a high-level process map right after we start working on the charter. Matter of fact, I use the chartering exercise as a way to kick off your high-level process mapping work. In a project charter, and we've had earlier videos on this, there's a section in every project charter for a process improvement project that says what are the boundaries of this process, beginning and end. And as soon as that has been described in the charter, I'll take a timeout in which, as we're working on the charter, we actually then start building the high-level process map. If we've got beginning and end, I'll then ask the team, let's expand that out. Let's take a look at how this is when it's performed in a Kaizen event. So I pulled this information again from the Business Process Improvement Workbook. This is just the summary of the before activities, the pre-event activities, the during event activities, and the follow-up activities. And right here, the morning of the very first day of the actual event, when we're documenting reality, that's when we'll perform a process mapping exercise. And in some cases for a Kaizen event, depending upon the size of the team and the amount of time that I've got, I may even have built it earlier without the team's input, and then I share that at the very first meeting, get the team's input, modify it, and go from there. You're always going to get team input, but whether you start from scratch or you start from a draft document, it's kind of up to you when you're running your Kaizen events. But in both DMAIC and Kaizen-based process improvement project work, it's something that happens early in the project. So now that we have an understanding of when it occurs in both DMAIC and Kaizen process improvement methodologies, and we know that there's a difference between the high-level map used for communication and the detailed map used for analysis. We'll now take a look at some pro tips on building a high-level map, making it an effective communication tool for the rest of your process improvement project. When we're thinking about building a high-level process map, I always remind team leaders or facilitators that are going to be building the map with a group of folks, let's keep it simple. I only use 3 common symbols when I'm building a high-level process map. I'll use squares or rectangles to indicate major activities, major steps, major work group functions. I'll use diamonds to represent decision points or inspection points, and then arrows to connect the rectangle squares or diamonds. I guess where I'm going with this is that common post-it notes are the primary tool that I use when I'm doing a high-level process mapping exercise. I either draw it on a whiteboard, the squares and the diamonds, or instead I will use the post-it notes. I love my post-it notes because it allows me to quickly make changes and modifications. Team members can update on the fly. Nobody feels concerned if a mistake was made and they want to change things around. I don't start with software, I end with software. After we've done a post-it note style exercise, we'll photograph the results, and then I'll eventually convert it into a flow chart using software-assisted tools. And more details on software-assisted tools in future videos with the detailed process mapping. All right, so if we now know that the intended purpose is to create a simple communication tool known as a high-level map, and we're going to be treating it as a post-it note style exercise first. Here are some additional pro tips that I give folks who facilitate a high-level process mapping exercise. The map that you create in this very first session may change over time. You'll do iterative updates as you obtain more new information about the process. But for it to be a good communication tool, first, let's keep it simple. It needs to fit on a single page. By making sure that folks realize that we can't have too many objects in the diagram. Too many objects are going to create cognitive overload for the end user. And when people get overloaded, they get confused and they get resistant to the actual artifact itself. So I always tell folks in advance, we're going to try to keep it simple. When we do map out a high-level process map, early in the process, we're going to map out the common path for this process. Later in this video, I'll give some more details on the common path in an applied example that we worked through. And if it's going to fit on a single page, the rule of thumb that I use for total number of boxes and decision diagrams is the early research that was done on cognitive overload. The early research that was done to figure out the 7-digit phone number, those early cognitive overload studies are often used in process mapping textbooks as well for how many objects to fit on the page. And so I like to see 5 to 9 boxes that show up on the screen or on the page. And in the end, what I tell my teams are, look, we need to describe the system from the beginning of the first step to the end of the last step, but it has to be simple. It can't be too many steps, but these are just rules of thumb. If in order to accurately describe the system, I have 8 or 9 or 10 boxes, I'm not going to stop the exercise. I'm going to go with what we've got. It's got to be an accurate description of the system in its entirety. For the next topic on how to draw highly variable processes using a back-to-front approach, I'm going to be referring to the travel reimbursement case, which was covered in an earlier video. If you haven't had a chance to view that video, now is a great time to go back and see that. But in the next screen, I'll have drawn the first 4 steps of the travel reimbursement process. All right, I've drawn out crudely, I might add, I've drawn out the travel reimbursement process. It began at form fill out. There was there was a review step by the local manager, an approval by corporate, and then some data entry. And then there were a whole bunch of other steps involved. It was about an 8-step process. One of the common issues that I see with poorly performing processes in the process mapping exercise itself, when we're creating the high level process map, is how teams will sometimes struggle if they've got beginning already determined through the elements inside the charter, and we ask, well, what's the next step? We know these are the first 4 steps, but if I were doing this exercise and I was asking the team, what's the next step? Frequently, what I'll hear team members say is, well, wait a minute, Scott, when we're filling out the form, sometimes in the Madison office, the Madison group does it one way, the Chicago group does it a different way, the San Francisco group does it yet another way. And oh my gosh, the folks in the London office, they follow European rules, and that's an entirely separate way. And we haven't even considered the fact that on end of the month, we know that we never fill it out the normal way. We just go straight to accounting because they're overloaded with other tasks and activities that have to happen. When I have team members create all sorts of alternative paths just in the very first step, I know that what I need to do is perform the exercise in a back to front way. Here's what I mean. All right, I've cleared up my screen just a little bit, given us a little bit more real estate to draw on. Here's how back to front process mapping works. With a team in the room, what I'll do is I'll take my boundary conditions that were defined in the charter of beginning and end, and instead of documenting the process from the first step through to the last, I'll start at the last step and I'll ask the team, what is the last step before the customer receives their fulfilled product? Or sometimes I'll ask, what is the fulfilled product or service request? And in the travel reimbursement case, it was a check. It was the money that we received that we could then deposit in the bank. And then I will ask the team to work backwards from there, asking the question, what had to happen in order for the check to occur? What was the very previous step? And in travel reimbursement, it was the HR group delivering the check at the end of the week. And I'll just summarize that HR delivery with box HR. I'll then ask the group, well, what did HR need for the delivery of the check? And they respond that the bank had to create the check. And then I continue to work my way back to the very first step. And then we know that when we connect these steps with our flow arrows, the back to front method creates this flow from beginning to end that we sometimes call the happy path or the common path. When you work back to front in a process mapping activity this way, you create the happy path, the common path. It may not be the representation of all of the frustration in the system, but it should be representation of what the system looks like when it's performing satisfactory. We use that then as the high-level process map used for communication. For our detailed analysis, we'll create a separate map called a detailed map, and that will contain all of the rework loops in the system. It'll contain all of the massive amounts of white space or idle time handoffs. We'll identify all of the lean waste that's occurring inside of each step. We'll describe the large amount of variation that's occurring in steps as well. But for a high-level process map, the common path or the happy path is a great visual for people to easily understand what the system is about.